If you are someone who is trying to work on the muscle of critical thinking and trying to leave behind doom scrolling, you might be struggling to do so. And you might be struggling to do so because some of the strategies that you find online involve a great deal of work. And so to that, I offer you the power of the short story. For those of you who are new here, I'm Vale. I live in the Colombian countryside. I talk about a lot of different topics, but recently I've been very interested in the topic of how we might keep our critical thinking skills sharp in a world that is asking us to slowly give up the power to think independently about everything that is going on around us. As an avid reader, as a person who reads a lot, I have been on online spaces about reading for years, right? And I love them, right? I love Book Talk. I love Bookstagram. I love getting recommendations from fellow readers. However, I do think that there is an overemphasis on full-length books and not enough of an emphasis on the power of the short story. A short story is a very broad, term that we use for short-form fiction. It can be anywhere from like a paragraph to 25 pages is usually the max, although there is also novellas, which some people consider short stories, etc., right? It's a short form of fiction. If it was nonfiction, it would be an essay, but it is not. It is fiction. And so when we're thinking about the short story, we're thinking about a world that is built in very few pages. And this is critical to why I believe short stories are even superior to full-length novels. The short story, after all, is trying to invite you into a very specific moment in time, into a very specific story, into a very specific character. It doesn't have to have a beginning that is super clear like in a novel. It doesn't have to have an end that's super clear like a novel. Instead, in my opinion, a good short story leaves you with a feeling that you cannot shake, right? Something that you're like, oh my God, something like in this story I cannot stop thinking about, even though it was such a short form of fiction. So when we, for example, are looking at how we might increase our critical thinking, we tend to look to full-length books, right? We're like, okay, if I just read this full-length book, I'll know more about XYZ. I'll be able to apply that to my life. I'll be more well-read, etc. And yes, that is true. However, reading a full-length book is going to take you a lot longer. And what we want to get in the practice of doing is having opinions, right? Applying a piece of media to your life immediately. And to that end, I say the short story is a much more effective tool than a full-length novel. Some of the best authors in the world have short stories that many people don't know about, right? So for example, Lauren Groff, who is an amazing author. A lot of people do know her for her short story collection, Florida, but I think in the recent years, people have really leaned into her historical fiction books. And all of that is great. And yet some of the best short stories that I've ever read come from her in her earlier work. And so it is an invitation to get to know authors a little bit more closely if you are a deep reader. All right, so today we're here to talk about the short story. So when I am online and I am seeing people give advice to others about how they might develop their intellectual taste or how they might become, stronger critical thinkers, it obviously involves a lot of reading full-length books, either nonfiction or fiction, right? That is par for the course. You have to read in order to become a critical thinker. However, I don't think that full-length books are necessarily the most accessible way to start to develop that brain muscle, right? You kind of want to scaffold that a little bit and give yourself the ability to start making opinions quickly without necessarily having to read a full-length book. So that's definitely one reason that short stories are a good option if you are trying to dabble in that world of academia. But also personally, I believe short stories are sometimes, and if not often, better than full-length novels. This is my personal opinion, right? I think a lot of people on Book Talk and Bookstagram would disagree. But personally, the power behind a strong short story, to me, is more difficult to achieve than in a full-length book because you have less pages to be able to do it. I'm a fangirl of many different authors, and I think a lot of times people skip like the short stories written by some of their favorite authors, or maybe they just don't know about them. And I think it's such a missed opportunity to learn more about the different people who you enjoy to read. But even if you are not an avid reader and you are, again, just looking for an entry point to start to form your personal taste in reading, short stories are going to offer you that avenue. Obviously, this is because of their length, right? You are able to sit down and read a short story usually in one sitting. Sometimes if you're kind of like a little little bit scattered, you might need like 2 sittings. But really, if you dedicate an hour to a short story, you can read that short story and have time to think critically about it and apply it to your life and to the world around you. And so that is definitely what I want to spend some time talking to you all about. How do we read short stories, or how should we read short stories in a way that makes it a part of our developing intellectual personal style? I also want to say that when we're thinking about becoming critical thinkers, part of that is so that we might be more aware of maybe propaganda around us, fake news around us, of manipulation around us. All of that is true, right? That's why we want to become critical thinkers. But there is also a part of us that wants to share, right, what we know, whether that's in our personal life, with our friends, with our close ones, whether it's at work, whether it's, right, there's a desire to apply our learning to the parts of the world around us. And so to that end, I think that the faster that we're invited to connect our views and beliefs to a piece of media, the faster that we can start to integrate that into our lives, right? So when we listen to a song, for example, we can pause at the end of that song, take a second and say, oh, you know what? Like, this is what I felt about that song. Here's how it applies to like my other musical tastes, etc., right? With literature, we don't really tend to do that. We don't really tend to be trained to stop and think about how this applies to our lives. And also, the average person reads very few books a year. And so there are fewer opportunities to be able to step back and say, you know, this is what I learned from this piece of reading, and here's how it applies to my other, you know, literature tastes or the world around me, etc. And so what we're really trying to do here is to expand the field of opportunity for you to form an opinion, okay? And so that's why I am recommending this short story, because even though you probably read a few short stories when you were in high school, maybe even college, it seems to be a medium that is kind of ignored. It's kind of over there. It's an experiment for authors who want to get stronger in their writing, and for some of us who are avid short story readers, but really is not something that is mass consumed. And so I want us to use this as a tool to expand the field of opportunity, again, to form opinions, to apply to our lives, to think about, hey, like, actually, how does this connect to my views and my values and my belief systems about the world, okay? So this is, again, an opportunity to do this quickly and without having to invest too much time, and yet still getting the same return, which is to experience a world unlike the world that you're living in right now, or maybe a very similar world, but to experience a world that gets you thinking, that gets you maybe like excited, and that you can start to apply in your conversations with people, in your work. I think a lot of times in my own personal work, people are always like, oh my gosh, you're so creative. Like, you think outside the box. Like, how is it that? That's because I'm an avid reader, and I'm not an avid reader of novels. Like, yes, I read a lot of novels, but it's mostly the short stories that have created that in me, right? Because it's these short stories of like that world and that world and that world, and that gets you into this creative space as well. So I want to encourage you to see it that way as well. It's not just a way for you to consume as much as possible, but it's a way for you to be able to apply it to you as quickly as possible, which is what we want to see. And of course, it gives you something to do, right? If you're thinking about like, oh, I need an analog bag, etc. Like, I love nothing more than printing a short story and putting it in my bag, right? Not only because then I can read it when I'm like traveling or when I'm like whatever, but then I can give it to someone, right? I'm like, oh, I just read the short story. It was phenomenal. Here, you read it. Now we're having a mini discussion or a book club or whatever, but it's not really a book, and it's easier. It's more accessible. And so there is something to be said about that, right? Like, if you are somebody who, you know, wants to dip your feet into the world of short stories, you can print a few. You don't even have to buy them. A lot of them are free online on magazines, on different publications, right? And so it is an accessible ability to have something in your hand that you can read, you can mark up, you can pass on to someone else, and that is a beautiful thing as well, right? With a book, we might not be giving those books away because they're pretty expensive. With a short story, it's like, well, this was free and I printed it at work and I read it and I loved it, and here, and you can read it, and now we're building community. Okay, let's talk about how we should read short stories. I mean, I feel like they're pretty straightforward. You get it, you read it, right? But here's what I would do if I were you and I was trying to, again, develop my personal intellectual taste, and I'm using short stories to be able to do that. Here's what I would do. The first thing is I would read the story, right? Anything that's popping out to me as I'm reading it, I'm like, whoa, what a line. I usually like underline it because sometimes a short story can be very powerful. And so there's a lot of underlining that goes on, right? After I'm done reading the book, though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write 1 to 2 sentences summary, right? I mean, this is like 1 to 2 sentences, so it's not going to be the entire plot. It's going to be like, a person did this. This was the story, right? It's going to be short, to the point. This is what I took about. This is what I took out. This is what the story is about. So that's the summary. Once I have my summary down, that's just like a quick cognitive process of like, okay, I'm in the right, I understand what the story was about. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to apply it to the self, okay? And so what I'm going to do here is a gut check. What did I feel about the story, right? Because I'm starting again to develop my own taste. I have to start to apply that through this story. So, for example, I'm reading a short story and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is how it made me feel. I'm going to jot that down. That's my connection to self, because what I feel about something, my gut check, that is connected to my values and my beliefs, and that is all in there ruminating. I just have to go ahead and take a second and write it down, okay? And so again, I do my summary and my gut check. What did it make me feel? Because that's the relation to self. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to relate it to the world around me. That's probably the easiest thing to do, because if you're somebody who's paying attention to the world around you, you kind of are able to apply like, okay, this is the message of the short story. Here's how it applies to the world around me. There are some short stories that you might be like, well, what is the connection to the world around me? And you might have to think a little bit more deeply, but I assure you that like everybody who's sitting down in front of a typewriter to write is saying something about the world, okay? And so what we're asking you to do here is just to take a step back and be like, what is it that this author is saying about the world through this short story? And just write down a sentence, okay? So now we have the summary, we have our gut check reaction of like, what did this story make me feel? And we have that connection to the world around us. Like, this is what I think the commentary is about the world around me. And then finally, I would do a connection to other media, right? Because again, we want to start to develop our personal tastes. And so just like when we listen to a song and we start to subconsciously like say, oh, I like that song because it reminds me of that song, or it reminds me of this genre that I like, and I like this genre, and I know that about myself. I know I've always liked pop rock, and so this is a pop, right? Just like we would do that with a song, innately without actually really thinking about it, we're going to do that with a short story. What does this remind us of? Does it remind us of a movie? Does it remind us of a song, of another short story, of another book, of something I saw on TikTok, of something I saw on Instagram? Just pick one, right? Like, connect it to another piece of media. That is the cognitive thinking that we want to start to do. We read one short piece of fiction because again, it was something that was accessible. We read it in like under an hour, and now we've got the summary, we've got the connection to self, the connection to the world around us, and the connection to other pieces of media. And in that very quick circle, we've developed that personal taste just a little bit more, and then with the next short story just a little bit more, and then so on and so forth, and it starts to get stronger. Your gut feeling about what you like and what you think and how it relates to you and how it relates to the world starts to sharpen, right? And you didn't have to invest reading an entire novel, and I would even argue that you did it in a way that was more sticky than if you did read a full novel, because if you read a full novel, it would take you a lot longer to pull the themes and the summary and the etc. Okay, I also just want to say that like you should read novels. Like this is not an anti-novel video, okay? This is just a way for you to think about reading a little bit differently. Let me give you an example with a very popular short story that you've probably read in the past. Okay, let's talk about The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. I hope that there are no spoilers here because this is a very old short story that has been taught across classrooms in the United States for years. Now, in The Lottery, and this is our summary, a town is getting ready for some sort of town hall meeting, right? We hear about all the different townspeople. We get descriptions of the settings. We get descriptions of the town hall center. And at the end, you realize that what is happening is really a reaping, right? And a person is being chosen from the town to be stoned, and the other townspeople are the people doing the stoning. And the idea here is that in order for them to have this sort of utopian society, they've agreed to this reaping in which one person is killed every single year, and everybody in the community, even though they're all community members, they all decide to turn against one person, and then they stone that person. So that's the summary. And so the next thing that I need to do is connect it to myself, right? We have to start with the self. And so my initial reaction to this is, okay, gross, right? Because I'm starting to pull from my own personal views and beliefs and values about justice and fairness, right? And so when I'm thinking about my gut check reaction is that I'm not surprised that something like this would happen. I've actually witnessed a lot of things in the world that maybe make it feasible for this kind of violence to exist, but it is something that I have always personally been against. I've always been personally against the idea that like one person should be sacrificed for the the good of everyone, right? The good of the many. And that is a kind of philosophical position, right? So again, I'm pulling sort of from my own values and beliefs about fairness and truth and justice. My gut check, right, when after I read that story is like, this is messed up, right? So that's just what I would write down. I have my summary and I would have my gut check of this is messed up. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to connect it to the world around me. Easy, right? Because if we're looking at the world around us today and you have any sort of ounce of like critical knowledge, you know that there are many people in society that are being scapegoated in order to make it seem like it's their fault, like all the problems in society are their fault, and therefore we would sacrifice that person or that group of people for the betterment of everyone else, aka the people in power, right? And so there are a lot of examples of how this happens in the world today. You can even look at like the way that trans people are being targeted right now, where it's kind of like, okay, even though you were a member of our community 2 seconds ago, now we believe that everything is your fault, and therefore if we just sort of get rid of you or stone you, then everybody else will be okay. So there's that element of it, but there's also an element of cowardice to me in the townspeople. They are, to me, people who are sort of saying, I'm going to stone that person because at least it's not me. And that's something that I also notice in the world around me today. I notice a lot of people kind of putting their heads down saying, you know what, yes, things are really bad for those people, but at least it's not me, right? And so that is something that I can recognize as a part of society around me, that this short story gives me the language for, right? And the next thing is my connection to other media. There are many pieces of media that I can connect this to, particularly like The Hunger Games, right? Which is a book that I really like, but also a movie and something that people have in the lexicon, maybe a little bit like they know a little bit more about, right? Like I feel like a lot of people have seen The Hunger Games, a lot of people have read The Hunger Games, and so that is a connection to media that I can make, and I can write that down. Now, what do I do now, right? Now what has happened? Now all of this thinking is in the back of my mind. I've read the short story, I've thought about it, I've connected it. Next time I'm in conversation with people and some of these things start to come up, I can say, well, have you read The Lottery? Let's talk about that. It's like that. Okay, now we can talk about that, right? Or I might be at work, right? And like that might be something that I cite when I'm thinking about like the way that society is behaving under a fascist regime, right? So there are things that where I might cite that piece of reading, right? Or maybe somebody's talking about the new Hunger Games movie or I'm like, oh, did you read The Lottery, right? So here we start to see how by reading short stories, we're putting little pieces of tidbits of information in our pocket we can pull up and use throughout our different interactions with people and with the world around us. So that's one example using The Lottery. Okay, I could spend hours talking about short stories and the short stories that I love. Personally, I love short stories that are dystopian, but there are so many other types of short stories. There are short stories that are romances. There are short stories that are funny and comedic. Dave Eggers writes a mean short story. I think every time I read one of his short stories, I end up like in a place where I'm like hopeful and like full of life again. I would say George Saunders is also a person that I really admire. I would say a lot of people consider him the king of the American short story, and I would agree. If you are somebody who is trying to maybe connect to anti-capitalist ideas, George Saunders is somebody to check out. Lauren Groff is one of the best writers of our generation, but also a phenomenal short storyteller. Her short story collection, Florida, is something that I come back to time and time again. Jennifer Egan has a short story collection that won the Pulitzer, and it's called Welcome to the Goon Squad. That short story collection is bookmarked everywhere because it is so beautiful, and it is like the idea of like how you can access literary fiction and how you create a literary fiction world in such short amount of words. I would say Catherine Lacey is also a great author when it comes to short stories. There are so many examples, right? I have picked 4 short stories because I want to invite you to try these exercises on your own. I picked short stories that are free, that you can access via these links. There are short stories that you can't access for free because they're found in collections or they're found in people's books, and I do encourage you to go and try those out as well. But if you're just trying to get started and you're like, give me 4 good short stories, here they are, okay? The first one is Grand Mal by Joanna Pearson. This is if you like true crime. If you like true crime, go ahead and read Grand Mal because it is so good. And there's like twists, but you just have to read it, okay? So if you're somebody who's like, I want to do a little bit of like that like sort of thriller vibe, go for that one. Next, we have Baboons by Susan Shepard. What I love about Baboons by Susan Shepard, which does have to do a little bit with drug addiction, is the way that she shifts between different locations, and each of them is so descriptive. I would say that that's a really great example, and I feel like that is a short story that I read years ago and I still think about, right? I still find myself, particularly when I'm in other countries, thinking about that short story. Next, we have Love Letter by George Saunders. Like I mentioned earlier, George Saunders is a master of the craft, and he has so many, like Civil War Land. He just has so many short story collections. 10th of December, very famous, right? This one is in the New Yorker, I believe, but it is particularly relevant to living in an increasingly more authoritarian society, and it's told through letters, which I think is also a very interesting medium. It's also very short, which I know these are short stories, but that one's particularly short, but it's so powerful. So George Saunders tends to be more comedic, and this is, I would say, not so much of a comedic short story, which I also think is interesting. And finally, we have The Castle of Rose Tellen by Kate DiCamillo. Kate DiCamillo is a very famous children's book author, so you might have heard of her work before. You've probably read some of it. She wrote Because of Winn-Dixie. She wrote some of those types of books that you probably saw in the library growing up. This short story is something that, it's not, I would almost say it's fairy tale like, because even the ending, I'm like, that would only happen in a fairy tale, but it is beautiful and it's funny, and like there's so much, like the symbolism is just so vivid. So I would say that you can start with those 4 short stories. None of these short stories take you more than 30 minutes to read, and you can do the exercise that I mentioned earlier with each of these short stories. Okay, so as a reminder, we have 4 steps to our process when we're reading short stories. The first is a quick summary. The second is you're going to get your gut reaction related to the self. The third is you are now going to relate it to the world around you. You're going to write a little sentence. How does this relate to the world that I'm currently living in? And the fourth is you're going to connect it to another piece of media, right? And that's it. You're going to put that in your journal. You could even have a little journal. That's just your short story journal. That's what I have. Every time I read a short story, I give myself a little page, and in just that page, I have a record of how I felt when I read the story, what the story was about, and how it connects to the world around me. Okay, that is it for today. I think I will probably do another video in the future going through all of my favorite short stories for those of you who are interested, because I do have a running list of them, and I think right now it's up to 25 or something, even maybe more, because I just finished a short story collection. There's a couple in there that I would add. But again, I do encourage you to continue to look for tools that help you break out of that zombie doom scroll that we're being conditioned to be in these past few years, okay? I feel like that is all that we're all trying to do. We're trying to think about how might we become more active in the world around us when everything seems aimed at dulling our own personal taste, our own personal intellectual style, okay? So there are many different ways that you can do this. If you are somebody that's like, I actually don't read short stories, I read full-length books, I don't need this, great. I love that you are still thinking critically. I would still invite you to pause after every book and to still participate in the exercise, because there is such a thing as overconsumption in reading. And if you're just pummeling through books and not taking a second to step back and think about how does this apply to me, then you're not pulling as much as you could from that piece of literature or that piece of media, okay? So even if you're reading full-length books, I invite you to use the exercise. But again, if you are somebody who's looking for ways to grow critically, your critical thinking a little bit more quickly, the short story is for you. Okay? If you read any of these, go ahead and let me know. I would love to know what you think, what your gut reaction was. But also, if you watch this video and you are somebody who has also read some really good short stories, please put them in the comments, because I love finding new short stories. Again, I print them out, I put them in my bag, I hand them out. This is my passion, okay? So if you're somebody that's like, I read the short story or the short story collection a few years ago and I can't stop thinking about it, let me know. And if you are interested in continuing to learn more about how we might become active thinkers in our lives, like and subscribe, and I'll continue to share this type of video. Okay, until next time.